Genetically modified foods are beneficial, and they actually make up about 75% of the products that are on the shelves in the US grocery stores today. So in this presentation, I'm going to kind of explain how they're beneficial and really just what they are. So to understand how they're beneficial, we first have to talk about the adverse health effects of pesticides on our farmers, which is even if they're wearing protective gear like this farmer is. So they can cause anything from eye irritation, skin irritation, nausea, and headaches, to something that I read on Jameer research protocols that said long-term exposure to pesticides has been linked to a broad range of chronic health effects, including impairing neurobehavioral function, respiratory problems, obesity, and even diabetes. Another website that I looked at, called Pesticide Action Network UK, or PAN UK, said that they're linked to a range of serious illnesses and diseases from respiratory problems to cancer. So, pesticides can cause a wide range of problems, from something small like just eye irritation or skin irritation, all the way up to something really serious like cancer. Pesticides also harm the environment, and they definitely harm the animals after the field's been sprayed. So since the animals don't really know, like, to stay away from the field after it's been sprayed, which the farmers know you have to stay out of the field for at least 2 days post-spray, or else you will definitely get all of the adverse health effects that I've talked about, because it'll be very concentrated still. So these animals will end up growing into the crop still, and they will end up dying, which leads to a lot of farmers reporting like an eerie silence after they spray, because all of the animals around and even the insects are dead, pretty much. So genetically modified foods actually reduce the amount of pesticides that need to be used. So BT corn is just a genetically modified form of corn, and I'll explain more what the BT portion of that name means on the next slide. But you can see that as the BT corn goes up here, the amount of insecticide, which is pretty much the same as pesticides, severely is reduced, all the way to 2010, where it's pretty much zero. So since there's not as much insecticide or pesticide being used, the farmers are actually becoming healthier because they don't have to have long-term exposure to all of the pesticides, which will cause the adverse health effects. So the BT crops is actually something called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a mouthful for sure. But that just basically means it has the cry and crit proteins, which are toxic to most of the common pests like caterpillars, beetles, and flies. And this image over here kind of shows how it... So that right there is the BT protein, and that BT gene is inserted into the crop, which just makes the entire thing basically not have to use pesticides. And if a pest feeds on any part of the plant, it will die. So then down here we actually have a picture showing the fruit damage of, and just comparing just a non-BT eggplant and a BT eggplant. So the one on the left is the non-BT eggplant, and you can tell that it was eaten by pests, and since it was like exposed to the outside elements because the pests kind of ate through it, it was obviously kind of browning and rotting a little bit. But the BT eggplant, since the pest died while eating any part of the plant, not just like the crop itself, it looks perfectly fine. It just looks like a normal eggplant. So, genetically modifying foods does not just have to be to reduce the use of pesticides. It can actually be to add more nutrients. So some of the most common ones are beta-carotene and vitamin A. Those are like the two most common of all of these common ones. Folic acid, folate, and iron. So an example of this would be the Golden Rice Project, where scientists basically just added vitamin A as well as beta carotene to rice, because a lot of the underdeveloped countries, like these ones here, you can tell Japan already had, like, they were pretty developed, they got pretty good amount of vitamin A already, but pretty much everything else where they have just a large supply of rice but not many like vegetables or anything to get the vitamins that they need, the scientists kind of gave them the golden rice. And it's called golden rice because adding the vitamin A and the beta carotene kind of gave it like a goldish color. But you can tell that the dark gray is the daily supply before the golden rice was implemented. You can definitely tell that this, which is where the golden rice was added, is a lot more like nutrient rich in comparison to what it was. And there was a popular science writer called Ed Regis who basically said that golden rice was going to save millions. He said, golden rice has not been made available to those for whom it was intended in the 20 years since it was created. This is just because of all the controversy against GMOs and everything like that. Had it been allowed to grow in these nations, millions of lives would not have been lost to malnutrition, and millions of children would not have gone blind. So you can definitely tell that the genetic modification of this golden rice would have been very helpful had it not been so controversial, just the use of genetic modification. So another reason why genetically modified foods are beneficial is that they provide a larger yield. So about 8,700 years ago, we had this wild grass called teosinte, which was just a couple kernels going up like that, about the size of a quarter, maybe a quarter and a half. And that's about as large as it got, but there were just like a couple different parts of it since the plant was very branched. Until now, where we have our modern corn, which is a lot of kernels and a lot of rows, but the plant or the stalk pretty much only produces like one of the ears instead of just a lot of ears, just not very big ones. So this one here is not very branched. This one is super branched, which is what it kind of started out as. But in order for us to get the larger yield, we needed the corn to have just like one main branch so that it doesn't have to supply nutrients to a bunch of different branches. And that's how we got the corn we have today, which is obviously way bigger than a quarter, which is what that little gray speck there is. So you can definitely tell that that's going to provide a larger yield, and it will be more space consuming because you get more food for less space, because this is less branched and the ear is way bigger. So critics of genetic modification like to ask, can the genes mutate in a harmful way? So the answer kind of is yes. There are 6 potential human health concerns, which of course is toxicity, which is just if it's like poisonous or whatever, allergic reactions, antibiotic resistance, immune suppression, cancer, or potential loss of nutrition. But we don't really have to worry about that because these are tested very heavily by the FDA, and they are actually removed from the market if they are proven to be harmful, if they even make it to the market. So the FDA does very heavy testing, and it is also very difficult to create the genetically modified foods because they have to go through a very scientific process in order to get their modifications to actually produce the result that's wanted. So this is just a bunch of, like a team of scientists working really, really hard trying to produce one bit of, like, some form of genetic modification that they want. So It's definitely very well tested by the scientists, and the FDA basically says that the modification must be healthy, or it has to be healthier than their non-genetically modified counterpart. And then, of course, the FDA interviews the engineer or the engineers of the genetically modified food. The food itself is tested extensively for potential allergens. They do a form of gastric stimulation to see how fast the food digests, and if it takes 1 minute and 30 seconds or less, it is not an allergen, but if it takes longer, it actually is an allergen, and they have to pretty much start back over, try to figure out how to make it so that it's healthy. And it's just put through a lot of revisions until the FDA is happy with the end result. And there are a couple different types of genetic modification. The first type is the most common type here. It's genetic engineering, which is basically scientists copying a gene with a desired trait, and they put that trait into a different organism. So an example of that would just be like the BT crop that we talked about before. There's also genome editing, which is just scientists changing the genes of a crop to make it produce what they wanted. An example of that would just be like removing an unwanted trait from something. And then there's selective breeding and crossbreeding, which people who disagree with genetic modification don't typically see that as like a form of genetic modification, because they're the more traditional types. Selective breeding is you breed two parent crops with a desired trait to make their offspring have the desired trait as well, so that there will just be a lot of the desired trait. And then crossbreeding is just combining two different species or varieties in order to get the trait that you want. And then this is just a works cited page. And then this is my second works cited page. So you can definitely tell that the genetic modification is definitely helpful, and it's beneficial to pretty much all human life.